In the winter of 1919, Europe lay scarred by the unprecedented carnage of the First World War, a conflict that had claimed over 16 million lives and left economies shattered. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, attempted to impose a new order, but instead, it created the conditions for resentment and future conflict. Germany was forced to accept sole responsibility for the war under Article 231, pay reparations totaling 132 billion gold marks, and cede territories including Alsace-Lorraine to France, Ypres and Malmedy to Belgium, and significant portions of Prussia to the newly reconstituted Poland. Its army was limited to 100,000 men, and the Rhineland was demilitarized. These measures humiliated the nation and left it economically crippled, setting the stage for political extremism. By 1923, Germany was plunged into hyperinflation, with the mark losing nearly all its value. Families found their savings erased almost overnight. Pensions became meaningless, and ordinary citizens struggled to afford necessities. In the midst of this chaos, radical ideologies found fertile ground. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, led by Adolf Hitler, emerged as a voice of both national pride and radical vengeance. Hitler, who had been imprisoned in 1923 for his failed beer hall putsch, penned Mein Kampf, a manifesto outlining his vision for a racially purified Germany, Lebensraum, and the obliteration of communism and Jewish influence. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazi Party capitalized on economic despair, nationalist sentiment, and fear of communism to rise to political prominence. Across Europe, authoritarian regimes were consolidating power. Benito Mussolini had taken control of Italy in 1922, establishing a fascist government that glorified the state, militarism, and expansion. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in October 1935 demonstrated both ambition and brutality, as the world watched a European power use chemical weapons and modern mechanized tactics against a largely defenseless African nation. In Asia, Japan's military-industrial elite pursued domination of China and the Pacific. The Mukden Incident of September 18, 1931, provided a pretext for Japan to invade Manchuria, creating the puppet state of Manchukuo. By 1937, Japan had launched a full-scale war against China, marked by atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre, signaling an era of aggressive militarism and imperial expansion. Meanwhile, democratic powers like Britain and France were reluctant to confront these rising threats. Scarred by the staggering losses of World War I, they pursued a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid another continental war. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, in particular, believed that satisfying some of Hitler's territorial ambitions could preserve peace. This strategy, however, underestimated the nature of Hitler's ambitions and overestimated his willingness to honor agreements. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, incorporating the country without significant international resistance. The world watched silently as Hitler violated Austrian sovereignty, demonstrating both the weakness of the League of Nations and the futility of appeasement. Later that year, Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, the ethnically German border regions of Czechoslovakia. The Munich Agreement, signed on September 30, 1938, by Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, allowed Germany to annex the Sudetenland without opposition, leaving Czechoslovakia defenseless. This concession became emblematic of failed diplomacy, as Hitler had shown that he would leverage threats and intimidation to expand his territory. The fragility of peace became even clearer in March 1939, when German forces occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia, violating the Munich Agreement and signaling that no further concessions would satisfy Hitler. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, sought to secure its own strategic interests. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the USSR signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland, caught between these two powers, became the immediate target. Germany's invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, employing the Blitzkrieg strategy of rapid mechanized assault combined with air superiority, marked the outbreak of World War II. The Soviet Union invaded from the east on September 17, sealing Poland's fate and demonstrating the coordinated ambitions of two totalitarian regimes. The global response was immediate but measured. Britain and France, bound by treaties to defend Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. But their initial actions were limited, resulting in the so-called Phony War, a period of tension without significant Western Front engagement. The United States, still recovering from the Great Depression and maintaining a policy of neutrality, refrained from direct involvement, though it would later play a decisive role. The world had entered a new era, one where modern technology, industrial capacity, and totalitarian ideology would shape a conflict on a scale never before seen. By the late 1930s, the stage was set for a global confrontation. The Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, were aligned by ideology and ambition, each pursuing expansion through military aggression. The Allies, initially Britain and France, were compelled to respond but were unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the war that was coming. Economically, socially, and technologically, the world had evolved since 1914, making the next conflict faster, deadlier, and more total than the last. Hitler's Germany had not only rebuilt its military, but had developed a doctrine of war that emphasized speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Mussolini's Italy and Japan's military campaigns added pressure across multiple theaters, ensuring that when the first shots were fired, the conflict would be truly global. Propaganda and ideology played a critical role in shaping societies for war. In Germany, the Nazis used rallies, newspapers, films, and education to instill anti-Semitic ideology and unquestioning loyalty to the state. Italy and Japan employed similar strategies, glorifying nationalism and militarism to justify expansion and suppress dissent. Democratic nations, while constrained by public opinion and pacifist sentiment, struggled to mobilize politically and militarily, contributing to the perception that totalitarian regimes could expand unchecked. When German tanks crossed the Polish border on September 1, 1939, it was the culmination of decades of unresolved tensions, economic crises, and political miscalculations. The world had failed to learn from history. Appeasement, isolationism, and underestimation of authoritarian regimes had converged to make war inevitable. By the end of that day, the die was cast. Poland would fall within weeks, and the global order would be irrevocably altered. The Second World War had begun, and no nation would remain untouched by its reach. September 1, 1939, dawned over Poland with little indication to ordinary civilians that the world was about to plunge into another catastrophic conflict. At 4:45 a.m., without a formal declaration of war, German forces crossed the border, unleashing Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, a military doctrine that combines speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. Tanks, mechanized infantry, and close air support advanced in unprecedented synchronization, designed to disorient, encircle, and annihilate the enemy before it could mount an effective defense. The Luftwaffe bombed airfields, communication centers, and cities, while panzer divisions smashed through Polish defenses with terrifying efficiency. Poland was unprepared for such a rapid assault. Its army, although brave and numerically significant, was dispersed and equipped with outdated weaponry. The campaign was further complicated by geography. The Polish corridor and the mountainous southern border offered little in terms of strategic depth, and fortifications along the western frontier were insufficient against mechanized warfare. Within weeks, German forces had penetrated deep into Polish territory, capturing key cities including Warsaw and Krakow. Civilians faced mass displacement and aerial bombardment, while resistance units fought valiantly but were ultimately overwhelmed. The invasion was executed under the terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a secret non-aggression treaty between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, signed on August 23, 1939. This agreement included a protocol dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, effectively sealing Poland's fate before the first shot was fired. On September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union invaded from the east, cutting off Polish forces and complicating any organized defense or retreat. By the end of September, Poland was fully occupied and partitioned, a brutal demonstration of modern mechanized warfare and geopolitical calculation. Britain and France, bound by treaties to defend Poland, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. Yet, despite the formal declarations, immediate action on the Western Front was minimal. This period became known as the Phony War or Blitzkrieg, during which the Allies mobilized, reinforced positions, and engaged in minor skirmishes, but no large-scale conflict erupted. Meanwhile, Germany consolidated its positions, preparing for the next phase of expansion. In April 1940, Germany turned its attention northward, launching simultaneous invasions of Denmark and Norway. Denmark, with its small military and flat terrain, fell in a matter of hours, while Norway's rugged landscape offered more resistance, but ultimately succumbed to combined German naval and airborne operations. Control of Norway secured vital access to iron ore shipments from Sweden and strategic ports along the North Sea, critical for Germany's war economy and naval operations. The rapid conquest of these countries demonstrated the flexibility of Blitzkrieg, combining paratroopers, naval forces, and mechanized units to seize key objectives quickly. May 10, 1940, marked a pivotal escalation as Germany launched a full-scale offensive against the Low Countries and France. German forces struck through the Ardennes forest, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line, a defensive barrier that French planners had believed impenetrable. Belgium and the Netherlands were swiftly overrun, and French defenses collapsed under the weight of German speed and coordination. Cities such as Rotterdam and Brussels were heavily bombed, and civilian populations were forced to flee in chaotic exoduses, often under aerial attack. The French army, despite numerical superiority and modern equipment, was unable to react effectively to the unexpected penetration through the Ardennes. German armored divisions executed encirclement maneuvers that cut off Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The situation deteriorated rapidly, culminating in the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and large numbers of French troops at Dunkirk between May 26 and June 4, 1940. Over 338,000 soldiers were evacuated across the English Channel in an extraordinary mix of naval vessels and civilian boats, a feat of logistical improvisation that saved a core of Allied manpower for the defense of Britain. Despite this miraculous evacuation, France's military position was untenable. German forces advanced relentlessly, occupying Paris on June 14, 1940. By June 22, the French government, now located in Vichy, signed an armistice with Germany, splitting the country into an occupied zone in the north and west and a nominally independent Vichy state in the south. This effectively removed France as a major military threat, leaving Britain to face Hitler's ambitions alone across the English Channel. During this period, Germany solidified its control over Western Europe, deploying occupation governments, reorganizing economies to support the war effort, and using propaganda to suppress dissent. The early success of Blitzkrieg had demonstrated not only the tactical brilliance of German military planners, but also the vulnerability of traditional defensive doctrines in the face of mechanized warfare. Air power, combined with rapid armored thrusts, proved decisive, signaling a new era in modern combat where mobility and coordination outweighed static fortifications. The early months of the war also revealed the human cost of modern warfare. Civilians in Poland, Belgium, and the Netherlands faced aerial bombardments, forced displacement, and the beginnings of occupation policies that would escalate into widespread atrocities. German forces implemented reprisals, collective punishments, and harsh measures to suppress resistance, setting patterns that would recur throughout occupied Europe. Military operations were intertwined with ideological goals, as Nazi forces targeted political leaders, intelligentsia, and minority populations, foreshadowing the systemic persecution that would later define the Holocaust. By mid-1940, the world had witnessed the power and speed of German military doctrine. Blitzkrieg had crushed Poland, neutralized the Low Countries, and forced France into surrender in less than 6 weeks. Britain stood isolated, facing a continental enemy with overwhelming momentum, while the Soviet Union consolidated its gains in Eastern Europe. The stage was set for the next phase of the conflict, the Battle of Britain and the struggle for air supremacy that would determine whether Hitler's ambitions could extend across the English Channel. The war that began on September 1st, 1939, had already demonstrated the lethality of modern combined arms tactics, the consequences of political miscalculation, and the terrifying scale of a conflict that would soon engulf the globe. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone against the Axis juggernaut. France had fallen in June, the Low Countries were occupied, and German forces had secured continental dominance. Adolf Hitler turned his attention across the English Channel, planning Operation Sea Lion, the long-anticipated invasion of the British Isles. But before any amphibious assault could occur, Germany faced a fundamental obstacle: the Royal Air Force and Britain's command of the skies. The ensuing struggle, known as the Battle of Britain, became the first major campaign to be fought entirely in the air, and its outcome would shape the trajectory of World War II. The Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring, sought to achieve air superiority by destroying the RAF's fighter command and crippling Britain's defensive infrastructure. Beginning on July 10, 1940, German bombers and fighters launched coordinated attacks on airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories across southern England. The Luftwaffe deployed over 2,600 aircraft, organized into Luftflotten, each with specialized tasks ranging from interception to bombing raids. Their initial focus was on RAF airfields and radar installations, aiming to incapacitate Britain's ability to detect incoming attacks and scramble fighters effectively. Britain's response was both technological and organizational. The chain-home radar network, fully operational along the southern and eastern coasts, provided early warning of incoming raids, allowing fighters to be deployed efficiently. Fighter squadrons, primarily flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, engaged German bombers and escorts in dogfights over the skies of Kent, Sussex, and the Thames estuary. Pilots such as Douglas Bader and Johnny Johnson became symbols of resistance, while ground crews and civilians labored tirelessly to repair airfields, maintain aircraft, and produce new fighters under constant threat of bombing. By August 13, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched what came to be called Eagle Day, intending to deliver a decisive blow that would destroy fighter command. Initial attacks inflicted damage on airfields and radar installations, but British resilience, tactical ingenuity, and the advantages conferred by radar allowed the RAF to absorb the assault. German intelligence underestimated both the efficiency of British command structures and the ability of squadrons to rotate pilots and aircraft. Air battles intensified along the channel, with hundreds of planes clashing daily, yet the RAF maintained sufficient strength to prevent collapse. In September 1940, Hitler shifted strategy, targeting London and other major cities in what became known as the Blitz. The Luftwaffe launched nightly bombing raids intended to terrorize civilians, disrupt industry, and erode public morale. The Blitz began on September 7, 1940, and continued for 57 consecutive nights, with cities including London, Coventry, and Birmingham experiencing widespread destruction. Civilian casualties mounted, reaching tens of thousands killed and injured, while hundreds of thousands were displaced. Yet instead of breaking the will of the British people, the bombings galvanized national resolve. Underground shelters, such as the London Underground stations, became sanctuaries for civilians, while volunteer organizations coordinated emergency services, firefighting, and medical care amidst relentless bombardment. The RAF adapted to these attacks, utilizing radar to intercept bombers at optimal ranges and employing flexible defensive tactics. Fighter Command continued to engage Luftwaffe formations, often at odds in numerical strength, but advantaged by home territory and shorter supply lines. Aircraft production in Britain accelerated, with factories in less vulnerable northern regions compensating for losses and introducing improvements to both Spitfires and Hurricanes. German bombing raids, while initially devastating, failed to destroy the industrial base, airfields, or the command and control structure necessary for Operation Sea Lion. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1940, German strategy fluctuated. Tactical errors, such as shifting from airfield targets to civilian areas, allowed the RAF crucial breathing space to recover and reorganize. The Luftwaffe also suffered from logistical constraints, long flight distances over the Channel, pilot fatigue, and high attrition rates among experienced airmen. By October, German losses had mounted to over 1,700 aircraft, while Britain lost approximately 900, demonstrating the unsustainable nature of prolonged offensive operations against a well-defended homeland. The Battle of Britain was not just a contest of numbers. It was a test of strategy, morale, and technological integration. The combination of radar, intelligence networks, disciplined command, and adaptive tactics allowed Britain to withstand repeated assaults. Civilians played an integral role, maintaining daily life under the threat of air raids, supporting civil defense measures, and participating in voluntary organizations to sustain public services. The resilience of the British population became a symbol of national unity and determination, reinforcing the narrative of a people's war, where every citizen contributed to defense and recovery. By the end of October 1940, the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve its objectives. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, was indefinitely postponed, and Germany shifted focus to the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean. The Battle of Britain marked the first major defeat of Hitler's military ambitions and demonstrated that air superiority alone could not guarantee victory. It also highlighted the interplay between industrial capacity, civilian morale, technology, and strategic command, factors that would define subsequent campaigns across Europe. The legacy of the Battle of Britain extended beyond the immediate military outcome. It solidified Britain's role as a central base for future Allied operations, from the eventual liberation of Western Europe to the coordination of the Atlantic theater. The battle also served as a cautionary tale regarding the underestimation of defensive capabilities, the importance of intelligence, and the limits of terror bombing as a strategy. RAF squadrons, despite enduring tremendous losses, became an enduring symbol of resistance, inspiring Allied forces globally and providing a foundation for subsequent air campaigns over occupied Europe. Throughout the campaign, the human dimension was omnipresent. Pilots faced near-certain death with each sortie. Civilians endured constant anxiety and destruction, and engineers and factory workers labored under threat of bombardment. Casualties were high, but the collective effort ensured that Britain remained unconquered. The Battle of Britain thus represented a turning point not merely in military terms. but in the broader psychological and strategic contours of World War II. The first clear indication that Hitler's advance could be halted and that the Axis momentum was not inexorable. The air war over southern England in 1940 was a crucible of innovation, endurance, and national resolve. By November, the Luftwaffe had been decisively checked, its capacity to mount further strategic campaigns over Britain effectively neutralized. The skies had become a proving ground, a theater where modern technology, human courage, and industrial mobilization intersected in ways previously unimaginable. Britain's survival ensured that the Allies retained a foothold in Europe, setting the stage for future campaigns across North Africa, the Mediterranean, and eventually the liberation of the continent itself. While the skies over Britain burned and the Western Front settled into a tense stalemate, Germany and Italy expanded their ambitions across Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. By late 1940, the Axis powers were demonstrating both strategic daring and operational overreach, exploiting weaknesses in Allied positions while setting the stage for a global confrontation. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, sought to assert its influence and recreate the glories of the Roman Empire, yet early campaigns exposed the limitations of Italian military planning and logistics. In September 1940, Italian forces invaded Egypt from their colony in Libya, aiming to seize the Suez Canal and extend Italy's North African holdings. The advance, however, stalled as British forces, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, mounted a swift and decisive counterattack from December 9th to 16th, 1940, pushing Italian troops back hundreds of kilometers to the vicinity of Tobruk. Italy's failures in Egypt forced Germany to intervene to protect its southern flank and maintain Axis credibility. Adolf Hitler dispatched the Afrika Korps under the command of General Erwin Rommel in February 1941. Rommel, later dubbed the Desert Fox for his tactical ingenuity and bold maneuvers, revitalized Axis operations in North Africa. He rapidly moved mechanized units across desert terrain, utilizing mobility, surprise, and concentrated firepower to outflank and encircle British positions. Early successes included the recapture of Cyrenaica and the siege of Tobruk, beginning in April 1941. The port city became a symbol of resilience, defended by Australian, British, and Indian troops under the leadership of Major General Leslie Morshed. Tobruk's defenders held out for over 8 months, refusing to surrender despite constant bombardment and isolation, forcing Rommel to adapt his strategy and delaying Axis plans for further Mediterranean operations. Meanwhile, the Balkans became another theater of Axis expansion. Italy's invasion of Greece in October 1940 had met unexpected resistance. Greek forces, well-led and highly motivated, repelled Italian advances into Albania, inflicting substantial casualties. Germany, concerned about a weakening southern flank and the risk of British intervention through Greece, launched invasions of both Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941. Operation Marita, beginning on April 6th, saw German forces swiftly penetrating Yugoslav defenses, while simultaneous attacks on Greece overwhelmed exhausted Italian troops. Belgrade fell on April 12th, and Athens was occupied by April 27th. German operations were characterized by rapid armored thrusts, coordinated air support, and the utilization of mountain troops in challenging terrain, reflecting the adaptability of Blitzkrieg doctrine in varied environments. In North Africa, Rommel pressed the advance into Egypt, reaching the vicinity of El Alamein by July 1942. His supply lines, stretched across hundreds of kilometers of desert, were vulnerable to British interdiction, yet he continued to apply pressure with audacity, utilizing combined arms to exploit gaps in Allied positions. The British Eighth Army, under General Claude Auchinleck and later Bernard Montgomery, reorganized and reinforced defensive positions at the Alamein line, leveraging intelligence from decrypted German communications via ultra-intercepts. This allowed the Allies to anticipate attacks and prepare countermeasures, setting the stage for a pivotal confrontation in the North African campaign. The Mediterranean theater's strategic significance extended beyond Egypt. Control of Libya, the Suez Canal, and access to oil supplies in the Middle East were critical for both Axis and Allied operations. Naval operations became crucial, with the Royal Navy enforcing blockades, protecting convoys, and contesting Axis supply routes through the Mediterranean. Air power played an equally decisive role. The Luftwaffe and Regia Aeronautica, Italian Air Force, sought to dominate the skies, bombing ports, supply depots, and coastal positions, while the RAF conducted reconnaissance, interdiction, and tactical support for ground forces. Beyond the desert, political and social dynamics influenced the course of campaigns. Local populations in North Africa, including Libyans, Egyptians, and Sudanese, were affected by occupation, conscription, and economic disruption. Infrastructure such as roads, railways, and ports was both a military asset and a target, as supply lines were the lifeblood of mechanized warfare in a harsh desert environment. Water scarcity, extreme temperatures, and desert storms added layers of complexity to logistical planning, forcing both sides to innovate in mobile engineering, fuel transport, and field maintenance. The Axis expansion also had implications in the global strategic picture. With Britain under siege but still resisting, Hitler and Mussolini aimed to secure the southern flank of Europe, ensuring access to the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern resources while diverting Allied attention from the Eastern Front, which would soon become the site of Operation Barbarossa. Control of Greece and Yugoslavia facilitated German access to the Balkans, airfields for operations in the Aegean, and the ability to secure oil pipelines and ports critical to sustaining the Axis war effort. By the end of 1941, the Axis had extended its reach across North Africa and the Balkans, yet the momentum of early victories began to encounter constraints. Logistics over long distances, the resilience of Allied forces, and the harsh desert environment slowed advances. In Tobruk, supply shortages, minefields, and determined defenders created prolonged stalemates. In Greece and Yugoslavia, guerrilla activity, sabotage, and terrain difficulties complicated occupation and consolidation. These factors highlighted a recurring theme in Axis strategy. Initial brilliance could achieve rapid success, but sustaining gains across extended theaters required coordination, supply, and manpower that were increasingly strained. In parallel with these operations, the political calculus in Italy shifted. Mussolini's ambitions were tempered by repeated failures in Greece and North Africa, leading to reliance on German support. Hitler, though focused on Western Europe and planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, recognized that Axis cohesion required intervention in theaters where Italy struggled. This dynamic underscored the interdependence of Axis powers and the fragility of their coalition, reliant on Germany's strategic leadership and military capacity. The North African and Mediterranean campaigns of 1940 to 1941 thus represented a testing ground for combined arms, operational mobility, and coordination among Axis forces. Rommel's desert warfare tactics, the use of armor and mechanized infantry, and the integration of air and naval power illustrated innovations that would influence subsequent campaigns in Europe and beyond. At the same time, Allied adaptation, including intelligence exploitation, reinforcement of critical positions, and the ability to coordinate multinational forces, demonstrated the resilience and strategic depth that would eventually turn the tide. As Axis expansion continued, the stage was set for some of the war's most consequential events. The forthcoming confrontation at El Alamein in 1942, the broader Mediterranean and Middle Eastern strategy, and the Eastern Front invasion that would engulf the Soviet Union. North Africa and the Balkans were not peripheral theaters. They were central to the global strategic balance, shaping resource allocation, operational priorities, and the timing of major offensives. By 1941, the war had truly become global in scope, with the desert sands of North Africa and the mountains of the Balkans serving as proving grounds for tactics, endurance, and the limits of Axis expansion. Halfway across the globe, the Pacific was a theater of escalating tension long before the outbreak of World War II in Europe reached its global scale. Japan, driven by a combination of militarism, imperial ambition, and the desire for natural resources, had already seized Manchuria in 1931 and escalated hostilities in China by 1937, occupying vast territories and committing atrocities such as the Nanking Massacre. By 1941, Japan faced strategic constraints. Economic sanctions imposed by the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, particularly the embargo on oil and steel, threatened to cripple its war machine. Japanese leadership, guided by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and the Imperial General Headquarters, resolved that decisive action was required to secure resources in Southeast Asia and the Pacific while neutralizing the American Pacific Fleet, which they perceived as the primary obstacle to their expansion. Planning for the attack on Pearl Harbor began in earnest in early 1941. Japan's strategy relied on surprise, precision, and the element of shock, aiming to incapacitate the United States' ability to project naval power in the Pacific for at least a year. The attack was meticulously rehearsed, with carrier strike groups training extensively in simulated operations. On the morning of December 7, 1941, a force of 6 Japanese aircraft carriers, including Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves over Oahu. At 7:55 a.m. local time, the first bombs fell, striking battleships, airfields, and installations across the harbor. The devastation was immediate and dramatic. 8 U.S. battleships were damaged, with the USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma suffering catastrophic losses. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, more than 1,100 wounded, and nearly 200 aircraft destroyed or damaged. Critical shore facilities and fuel depots were targeted, yet key assets, including American aircraft carriers, were absent from the harbor and thus survived the assault. The attack achieved tactical surprise but failed to destroy the fleet's mobile striking power, an oversight that would have profound implications for the ensuing conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor transformed the war from a European and Asian regional conflict into a truly global confrontation. On December 8, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his iconic Day of Infamy speech, and Congress declared war on Japan with overwhelming bipartisan support. Within days, Germany and Italy, allied with Japan under the Tripartite Pact, declared war on the United States, ensuring that the conflict would engulf multiple continents. The Pacific War had begun, marked by rapid Japanese offensives and a challenge that would test American industrial capacity, strategic planning, and military endurance. Japan's early campaigns were swift and devastating. By the end of December 1941, Japanese forces had invaded and occupied Hong Kong, British Malaya, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and parts of the Dutch East Indies. Filipino and American forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, faced overwhelming odds. The defense of Bataan beginning in January 1942 saw heroic resistance against a better-equipped enemy, but after months of siege, American and Filipino troops were forced to surrender on April 9, 1942, leading to the infamous Bataan Death March, where thousands perished during the forced transfer to prison camps. Japanese forces demonstrated both tactical brilliance in rapid, coordinated amphibious assaults and a ruthless approach toward prisoners and civilians, foreshadowing the brutalities that would define much of the Pacific War. Naval battles quickly became central to the conflict. The Battle of the Java Sea in late February 1942 resulted in the near-total destruction of Allied naval forces in Southeast Asia, securing Japanese dominance over the Dutch East Indies and its critical oil fields. However, Japan overextended its lines of communication, and logistical challenges in supplying distant garrisons would later become vulnerabilities exploited by the Allies. Japan's initial triumphs relied on speed, coordination, and the element of surprise, but sustaining occupation across vast oceanic distances presented strategic and operational challenges that would shape the mid and late stages of the war. The United States, though initially unprepared, rapidly mobilized. American industrial output surged, with shipyards producing aircraft carriers, battleships, and transport vessels at unprecedented rates. Aircraft production increased, with the introduction of carriers complement of fighter planes such as the F-4F Wildcat, and torpedo bombers like the TBD Devastator, later supplemented by the more capable TBF Avenger. Training programs accelerated, while military strategy began focusing on island hopping, a methodical campaign aimed at capturing strategically significant islands while bypassing heavily fortified positions, gradually moving closer to Japan's home islands. The turning point in the early Pacific War came at the Battle of Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942, though the seeds of that engagement were sown in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes, allowing Admiral Chester W. Nimitz to anticipate Japanese movements. The U.S. Navy sank 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, inflicting irreparable losses on Japan's carrier fleet while losing only 1 American carrier, the USS Yorktown. Midway halted Japanese expansion and marked a strategic shift in favor of the Allies, demonstrating the critical importance of intelligence, code-breaking, and naval aviation in modern warfare. Beyond naval battles, the war in the Pacific tested the limits of human endurance, logistics, and climate adaptation. Tropical diseases, harsh terrain, monsoon rains, and supply shortages presented persistent challenges for both Allied and Japanese forces. Campaigns on islands such as Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan became crucibles of attrition, where every gain was measured in immense human cost. The fanatical Japanese defense, including the introduction of kamikaze tactics later in the war, revealed a willingness to sacrifice units entirely to delay Allied advances, making the Pacific War uniquely brutal compared to European theaters. Civilian populations in occupied territories also suffered extensively. In Southeast Asia, Japanese occupation regimes imposed forced labor, requisitioned food and resources, and perpetrated mass atrocities. The occupation of Nanking, Manila, and other urban centers demonstrated a pattern of systematic violence against civilians, designed to instill terror and secure compliance, but leaving deep social and cultural scars that would last decades. By the end of 1942, the Pacific War had solidified into a protracted struggle of attrition, innovation, and industrial mobilization. Japan had secured its initial territorial objectives, but was beginning to face logistical constraints and the growing industrial might of the United States. The lessons of Pearl Harbor, the danger of complacency, the impact of intelligence, and the strategic significance of carrier aviation would guide Allied operations throughout the Pacific theater, culminating in campaigns that would span the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and eventually Okinawa and Iwo Jima. The attack on Pearl Harbor was thus both a tactical success and a strategic miscalculation. While it temporarily crippled the Pacific Fleet, it galvanized American public opinion, unified Congress, and military leadership, and initiated a response that leveraged the United States' industrial capacity to project overwhelming power across the Pacific. The war had entered a new phase, a contest of global reach, technological innovation, and human endurance that would continue until Japan's surrender in September 1945, reshaping the balance of power in Asia and the world. By 1942, the momentum of World War II began to shift as the Axis powers encountered both the limits of their logistical reach and the resilience of Allied forces across multiple theaters. In the East, Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, had driven German forces deep into the Soviet Union, capturing vast swaths of territory and pushing toward Moscow, Leningrad, and the Caucasus. Yet by the summer of 1942, Hitler sought not merely to consolidate gains, but to achieve decisive victory through the capture of Stalingrad, a major industrial and transportation hub on the Volga River essential for Soviet supply lines and symbolic of Soviet industrial strength. The German Sixth Army, commanded by General Friedrich Paulus, advanced with mechanized divisions and air support, aiming to seize the city and secure the southern flank for the larger drive toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. The Battle of Stalingrad, beginning in August 1942, evolved into a brutal contest of attrition. Urban combat, street by street and building by building, reduced the city to rubble and tested the limits of human endurance. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with tens of thousands killed or displaced, while Soviet defenders, including the 62nd Army under General Vasily Chukov, displayed extraordinary resilience. The Luftwaffe bombed relentlessly, yet each gain by German forces was met with tenacious Soviet resistance, often using snipers, booby traps, and improvised fortifications. Winter approached, and German supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of kilometers of frozen steppe, exposing the army to shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. In November 1942, the Soviet Red Army, under the command of Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive targeting the weaker Romanian and Hungarian units protecting the flanks of the German Sixth Army. Encirclement was achieved by November 23rd, trapping over 250,000 Axis soldiers within the city. Despite Hitler's insistence that Paulus hold his position, the Sixth Army faced starvation, disease, and constant bombardment. By February 2, 1943, the remaining forces surrendered, marking one of the deadliest and most decisive defeats for Germany in the entire war. The Battle of Stalingrad, with casualties exceeding 1.2 million between military and civilian losses, shattered the myth of German invincibility and heralded a strategic shift on the Eastern Front. Simultaneously, in North Africa, the Axis advance under Erwin Rommel threatened the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil fields critical to Allied supply. Rommel's Afrika Korps had pushed British forces back toward Egypt, capturing Tobruk in June 1942 after a prolonged siege. Yet British forces, reorganized under General Bernard Montgomery and bolstered by reinforcements from the Commonwealth, prepared a decisive defensive line at El Alamein. The First Battle of El Alamein, in July 1942, halted Rommel's advance, stabilizing the front and buying time for Allied reinforcements and logistical buildup. The Second Battle of El Alamein, beginning on October 23, 1942, marked a turning point in the North African campaign. Montgomery's meticulously planned offensive, leveraging superior artillery, armor, and intelligence derived from intercepted Axis communications, overwhelmed Rommel's forces. The battle was characterized by relentless bombardments, coordinated armored thrusts, and careful exploitation of minefields. After 12 days of intense combat, Rommel began a retreat on November 4th, and by February 1943, Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered to combined British and American troops following Operation Torch, ending the North African campaign and securing the Mediterranean for the Allies. Control of the Suez Canal and the southern Mediterranean reinforced Allied strategic positioning, enabling the subsequent invasion of Italy and providing a critical base for air and naval operations in the region. Meanwhile, Across the Pacific, the United States Navy, recovering from the shock of Pearl Harbor, began to regain the initiative. The Battle of Midway, from June 4th to 7th, 1942, became a decisive naval engagement that would alter the balance of power in the Pacific. Leveraging intelligence gained from breaking Japanese codes, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz anticipated the Japanese plan to seize Midway Atoll and prepared an ambush using aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. In the ensuing four-day battle, U.S. carrier-based aircraft inflicted catastrophic losses on the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, while losing only the Yorktown. This engagement destroyed experienced Japanese air crews, halted Japanese expansion, and allowed the United States to transition from a defensive posture to a strategy of island hopping, systematically reclaiming territory and advancing toward Japan's home islands. These simultaneous turning points across 3 theaters, Stalingrad in the east, El Alamein in North Africa, and Midway in the Pacific, illustrated the convergence of tactical brilliance, strategic planning, and the importance of intelligence, logistics, and resilience. Stalingrad demonstrated the peril of overextension and underestimating an opponent's willpower and capacity to recover. El Alamein highlighted the effect of careful preparation, concentration of forces, and coordination between infantry, armor, and air power. Midway underscored the decisive role of intelligence, technological advantage, and naval aviation in shaping the course of war across vast maritime theaters. Collectively, these battles marked the beginning of the strategic decline of the Axis powers. German and Italian forces, though formidable, faced the growing industrial and manpower capacity of the Allies. In the Soviet Union, the Red Army, hardened by the winter of 1941 to 1942 and bolstered by domestic mobilization and Lend-Lease aid, began systematic counteroffensives that would reclaim occupied territory. In North Africa, the collapse of Axis positions freed the Mediterranean and opened the pathway to Sicily and the Italian mainland. In the Pacific, Japan, despite initial brilliance, confronted a relentless industrial juggernaut in the United States, capable of replacing losses and executing complex amphibious and aerial campaigns. The human cost of these turning points was staggering. At Stalingrad, civilians endured starvation, bombardment, and occupation, while soldiers on both sides faced extreme attrition in urban combat. In North Africa, desert warfare imposed harsh environmental stress alongside intense combat, with heat, sand, and disease compounding battlefield dangers. In the Pacific, both Japanese and American forces faced tropical diseases, typhoons, and grueling logistical challenges that magnified casualties. These theaters revealed that World War II was not merely a contest of territory, but a crucible in which endurance, morale, and resourcefulness were as decisive as raw firepower. By the end of 1943, the combined effect of Stalingrad, El Alamein, and Midway had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. The Axis powers, previously on the offensive across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific, now faced an increasingly coordinated Allied response. The psychological impact was immense. Hitler's aura of invincibility had been shattered, Rommel's desert mystique tempered by defeat, and Japanese expansion stalled at the gateway to the Central Pacific. The Allies, for the first time, held momentum in multiple theaters, demonstrating that coordinated strategy, intelligence exploitation, and industrial superiority could begin to reverse the Axis tide. These battles were more than isolated military victories. They were symbolic markers of resilience, adaptation, and strategic foresight. They highlighted the interdependence of theaters, showing that events in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific could influence one another, shaping planning, resource allocation, and morale across the globe. Stalingrad, El Alamein, and Midway collectively set the stage for the Allied offensives of 1943 to 1944, including the invasion of Italy, the advance on the Eastern Front, and the eventual liberation of the Pacific Islands, providing a foundation upon which ultimate victory would be built. By 1943, the tide of World War II had begun to turn in favor of the Allies, driven by cumulative victories, strategic planning, and the exploitation of Axis overreach. In North Africa, the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943 concluded a grueling campaign that had spanned 3 years and multiple offensives. Operation Torch, the Anglo-American landings in November 1942 along the Moroccan and Algerian coasts, had established a second front against Axis forces and forced Rommel into retreat. The fall of Tunisia not only secured the southern Mediterranean, but also allowed the Allies to gain valuable combat experience in coordinating multinational forces across land, sea, and air, lessons that would prove critical in the Italian campaign. Italy, long an Axis partner but militarily less capable than Germany, became the next focal point. Following the collapse of Mussolini's regime in July 1943, precipitated by the Allied invasion of Sicily, the Italian King Victor Emmanuel III ordered Mussolini's arrest on July 25, ending his rule after 2 decades of fascist governance. Sicily, captured through a combination of amphibious landings and airborne operations beginning on July 9, 1943, provided the Allies with a staging ground for an invasion of mainland Italy. The campaign highlighted the increasing coordination between British and American forces, with the U.S. Fifth Army under General Mark Clark and the British Eighth Army under Montgomery moving through difficult terrain while overcoming German defensive positions. The Italian mainland campaign, commencing with landings at Salerno on September 9, 1943, was characterized by rugged topography, fortified German positions, and the skillful use of delaying tactics. German Field Marshal Albert Kesselring orchestrated a masterful defensive effort, utilizing mountain passes, rivers, and fortified towns to slow the Allied advance. Battles such as Salerno, Anzio, and Monte Cassino, stretching from September 1943 through May 1944, were marked by extraordinarily high casualties on both sides, the extensive use of artillery, and the challenges of coordination among multinational Allied forces. These engagements demonstrated the complexity of combined operations, the importance of air support in breaking stalemates, and the necessity of sustained logistical planning in difficult terrain. While Italy's liberation remained incremental, the Eastern Front saw the Soviet Union consolidate and expand its gains following the victories at Stalingrad and Kursk. Throughout 1943, Soviet forces launched a series of offensives, recapturing territories in Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Eastern Europe. Cities such as Kharkov, Smolensk, and Kiev were liberated as the Red Army systematically pushed German forces westward. Soviet strategy combined deep operations with encirclement tactics, employing mechanized armies to cut off German divisions and force capitulation. The human cost of these offensives was immense, with millions of soldiers and civilians suffering casualties from combat, forced evacuations, and occupation policies. Yet the strategic gains shifted the balance decisively on the Eastern Front. In the Western theaters, preparations for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, intensified. Deception operations, including Operation Fortitude, misled German intelligence into anticipating landings at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Air superiority, achieved through the sustained bombing of transportation networks and German airfields, reduced the Wehrmacht's capacity to respond rapidly to the impending invasion. Stockpiling of supplies, rehearsals for amphibious operations, and coordination of naval, air, and ground forces reflected the Allies' meticulous approach, learned in part from prior campaigns in North Africa and Italy. By June 1944, the stage was set for the largest amphibious operation in history. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, marked the commencement of Operation Overlord. More than 156,000 Allied troops, drawn from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other nations, stormed 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, under intense machine gun fire, artillery, and obstacles designed to impede assault. Airborne divisions had been dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt communications, bridges, and supply lines, creating confusion among German defenders. Casualties were high, but the Allies established beachheads, enabling the steady influx of reinforcements, armor, and supplies necessary to expand the foothold in Normandy. The fighting in the hedgerows, dense with natural and man-made obstacles, slowed the advance but demonstrated the Allies' capacity for coordinated, sustained offensive operations in challenging terrain. Following the breakout from Normandy, the Allies advanced through France, liberating towns and cities while confronting German counterattacks. The Falaise Pocket, completed in August 1944, encircled and destroyed large German formations, inflicting significant losses in men and equipment. Paris, occupied since June 1940, was liberated on August 25, 1944, in a combination of internal uprising by French resistance forces and advancing Allied armies. The liberation of Western Europe continued with the push into Belgium and the Netherlands, securing critical ports such as Antwerp to sustain the logistical needs of advancing forces. Amid these advances, coordination among the Allies proved increasingly effective. Air support from the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces neutralized German positions, while the integration of intelligence, both human and signals, guided operational decisions. Mechanized and armored units exploited breaches, artillery provided suppressive fire, and engineers cleared obstacles to maintain momentum. At the same time, civilian populations endured the upheaval of occupation and liberation, with cities and infrastructure heavily damaged by bombing, sabotage, and combat. Refugee movements and humanitarian crises added layers of complexity to military operations, illustrating that liberation was as much a political and social challenge as a military one. By the end of 1944, the cumulative effect of campaigns across North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe had significantly degraded Axis capabilities. German forces were increasingly stretched, facing multiple fronts and shortages in men, material, and fuel. Strategic bombing had disrupted industrial production, the Eastern Front absorbed significant Wehrmacht resources, and the Western Front pressured German defensive operations. These simultaneous pressures set the conditions for the final phases of the war in Europe, while demonstrating the effectiveness of multinational Allied strategy and the capacity to sustain long-term operations across diverse theaters. The period from 1943 to 1944 thus marked a decisive phase in the war, characterized by strategic planning, operational innovation, and the integration of multiple military branches in coordinated offensives. Lessons from North Africa and Italy informed Normandy and subsequent campaigns, while Soviet advances on the Eastern Front forced Germany to divert forces and resources. The liberation of occupied territories, though fraught with human suffering, signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, as Allied forces methodically eroded Axis control in Europe, setting the stage for Germany's ultimate collapse in 1945. By 1944, the Axis powers were increasingly strained, facing simultaneous pressure from multiple fronts, dwindling resources, and the growing industrial and military might of the Allies. On the European front, Germany's strategic position deteriorated rapidly. After the successful Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord had established a secure beachhead and allowed the buildup of forces for the liberation of Western Europe. The Falaise Pocket in August 1944 resulted in the encirclement and destruction of tens of thousands of German troops, severely weakening the Wehrmacht in France. By September, Paris was liberated, and Allied forces pushed through Belgium and the Netherlands, steadily approaching the German border. The relentless advance of the Western Allies forced Hitler to commit reserves, including SS divisions and hastily trained conscripts, to futile counterattacks, further depleting Germany's defensive capacity. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union maintained its offensive momentum. The Red Army launched Operation Bagration in June 1944, a massive offensive against Army Group Center, which resulted in one of the most devastating defeats in German military history. Soviet forces recaptured Belarus, inflicted catastrophic losses on German divisions, and opened the pathway toward Poland and the Balkans. The combination of Western and Eastern pressure created a pincer effect, forcing Germany to fight on multiple fronts, stretching supply lines, and leaving strategic cities vulnerable to encirclement. Amid this growing desperation, Hitler launched his last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, on December 16, 1944. Seeking to split Allied forces and capture Antwerp, German forces advanced through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, achieving initial surprise. Dense forests, winter storms, and limited visibility allowed German units to penetrate deep into Allied lines, creating a bulge in the front. However, Allied resistance, bolstered by reinforcements, the resilience of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, and effective air support once the weather cleared, stalled the offensive. By January 25, 1945, the attack had failed, resulting in over 100,000 German casualties and leaving the Wehrmacht exposed to counteroffensives from both east and west. The failure of the Ardennes offensive marked the final strategic initiative for Germany, signaling the imminent collapse of the Third Reich. As Germany weakened, the Allies pressed into the heart of the Reich. Soviet forces advanced through Poland, Romania, Hungary, and into eastern Germany, while Western Allies crossed the Rhine River in March 1945. By April, Soviet troops were encircling Berlin, and Hitler, isolated in his Führer bunker, faced the inevitability of defeat. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, and within days, Berlin fell to Soviet forces. Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, celebrated as Victory in Europe Day, V-Day, ended 6 years of brutal conflict on the continent, leaving cities in ruins, economies shattered, and millions dead. Meanwhile, the Pacific Theater continued its relentless pace. American forces pursued a strategy of island hopping, targeting key Japanese positions while bypassing heavily fortified garrisons. The capture of the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam between June and August 1944 provided airfields for the B-29 superfortress, enabling long-range bombing of the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, often considered the largest naval battle in history, resulted in the near-total destruction of the Japanese fleet, securing the Philippines for the Allies and cutting Japan off from its vital Southeast Asian resources. These campaigns demonstrated the strategic importance of maritime supremacy, air power, and logistical coordination in the vast Pacific theater. By early 1945, the Allies turned their focus to the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima, captured after 36 days of intense fighting from February 19 to March 26, 1945, became a symbol of sacrifice and strategic necessity, providing airfields for fighter escorts of B-29 bombers. The Battle of Okinawa, from April 1 to June 22, 1945, was even more brutal, with Japanese forces employing extensive kamikaze attacks, while fortified positions and civilian laborers conscripted into the defense. Over 12,000 American lives were lost, while Japanese military casualties exceeded 100,000, with tens of thousands of civilians killed or wounded. The ferocity of Okinawa revealed the likely human cost of a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands, shaping Allied decision-making regarding the use of atomic weapons. Strategically, the United States had achieved dominance in both the air and sea. Japanese shipping was crippled, industrial production severely reduced, and key cities were targeted in precision and area bombing campaigns. By March 1945, Tokyo had already suffered massive incendiary bombings, with tens of thousands killed and entire districts destroyed. The combination of conventional bombing, naval blockade, and attrition created conditions that made Japanese surrender increasingly likely, though Japanese leadership continued to cling to the hope of inflicting prohibitive costs on any invading forces. The final blow came in August 1945 with the deployment of atomic weapons. On August 6th, the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people and causing devastating long-term radiation effects. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered a similar fate, with an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 deaths. Confronted with unprecedented destruction and the threat of further atomic strikes, Emperor Hirohito intervened, urging surrender. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its capitulation, formally signing the instrument of surrender on September 2 aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, marking the end of World War II. The collapse of Axis powers across Europe and the Pacific by mid-1945 demonstrated the cumulative effect of strategic overreach, logistical limitations, and Allied coordination. Germany had been ground down by simultaneous operations from east and west, combined with strategic bombing and partisan activity behind its lines. Japan had been systematically isolated, deprived of critical resources, and subjected to overwhelming naval and air power. In both cases, the human cost was staggering. Tens of millions of military and civilian deaths, cities destroyed, and societies fundamentally altered. These final campaigns underscored the global scale of World War II. The conflict had evolved from regional ambitions into a total war involving industrial capacity, intelligence, technology, and endurance across multiple continents. The final year of the war revealed the limits of human endurance, the decisive power of coordinated strategy, and the profound consequences of totalitarian aggression. As the Axis powers crumbled, the Allies faced the immediate challenges of occupation, reconstruction, and addressing the humanitarian crises that the conflict had created. The end of World War II in 1945 left the globe profoundly altered, with landscapes, societies, and political structures reshaped by 6 years of total war. Europe lay in ruin. Cities such as Berlin, Warsaw, Dresden, and London bore scars from relentless bombing campaigns, artillery barges, and urban combat. Germany itself was politically and economically shattered. Following unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945, the country was divided into 4 occupation zones, administered by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. The Allies dismantled the remnants of the Nazi regime, confiscating weapons, closing down militarized industries, and preparing to reconstruct the political framework of a nation that had perpetrated atrocities across Europe. Millions of displaced persons, survivors of concentration camps, forced laborers, and refugees struggled to rebuild their lives amid the chaos. The human toll of the war was staggering. Estimates suggest over 70 million people died as a result of combat, occupation, starvation, disease, and genocide. Among the most horrific acts was the Holocaust, in which 6 million Jews, alongside millions of Romani people, Poles, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others, were systematically exterminated by the Nazi regime between 1941 and 1945. Concentration and extermination camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Bergen-Belsen became the grim symbols of industrialized murder, revealing the depths of human cruelty when ideology and state machinery intersected. The liberation of these camps by Allied forces, Soviets entering Auschwitz in January 1945, Americans liberating Buchenwald in April 1945, and the British freeing Bergen-Belsen, exposed the world to the magnitude of these crimes and sparked a global reckoning with human rights abuses. In Japan, the aftermath of the war was equally transformative. Cities such as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, destroyed by atomic bombs in August 1945, lay in ruins, while conventional bombings had decimated Tokyo, Osaka, and other urban centers. Estimates suggest that between 2.5 and 3 million Japanese civilians died as a direct result of the conflict, while millions more suffered injuries, radiation exposure, and displacement. The emperor's surrender announcement on August 15, 1945, marked the first time he addressed his subjects via radio, symbolizing the transition from imperial militarism to occupation under Allied oversight. American forces, under General Douglas MacArthur, administered Japan, overseeing demilitarization, political reform, and economic reconstruction, which included drafting a new constitution in 1947 and initiating social reforms to democratize the nation. The geopolitical landscape underwent a seismic shift. With Germany and Japan defeated, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as global superpowers, possessing unmatched military capabilities and ideological influence. The wartime alliance between these powers was fragile, held together only by a shared objective of defeating the Axis. By 1947, tensions between capitalist and communist blocs escalated into what would become the Cold War, dividing Europe with the Iron Curtain and leading to decades of proxy conflicts, nuclear proliferation, and ideological competition. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet influence, with countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Romania establishing communist regimes, while Western Europe aligned with the United States and NATO to ensure security and economic recovery. The United Nations was established on October 24, 1945, as a direct response to the failures of the League of Nations and the devastation wrought by global conflict. Its mission was to promote international peace, human rights, and economic cooperation, with the Security Council empowered to address threats to global stability. The post-war international order also included the creation of institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, aimed at stabilizing economies and rebuilding war-torn regions. Marshall Plan aid, beginning in 1948, facilitated the reconstruction of Western European economies, fueling rapid industrial recovery, urban reconstruction, and the reintegration of millions of displaced persons into society. Technology and military innovation accelerated dramatically as a result of the war. The development and use of nuclear weapons, long-range bombers, radar, jet aircraft, and advanced cryptography reshaped military strategy and heralded the beginning of a new era of technological warfare. The wartime production model also transformed industrial capacity. Mass production techniques applied to aircraft, tanks, ships, and weapon systems were adapted to civilian industries, driving post-war economic growth. The societal role of women had also evolved, as they had been indispensable to wartime industries, nursing, and support services. Post-war, women continued to influence labor markets, education, and social reform, laying the foundation for changing gender dynamics in the second half of the 20th century. The cultural and psychological impact of World War II was profound. Literature, art, and cinema grappled with themes of destruction, moral ambiguity, and human resilience. Survivors' testimonies, memoirs, and diaries chronicled personal suffering, resistance, and endurance, ensuring that the horrors and lessons of the war would not be forgotten. Commemoration became a critical tool in shaping national narratives, with monuments, memorials, and annual observances, such as Holocaust Remembrance Day, providing spaces for reflection, mourning, and historical education. War crimes trials were central to post-war justice. The Nuremberg trials, November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946, prosecuted key Nazi officials for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, establishing legal precedents for individual accountability under international law. In Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, April 29, 1946 to November 12, 1948, prosecuted Japanese leaders for similar offenses, reinforcing the principle that state authority did not exempt individuals from legal and moral responsibility. These trials confronted the challenge of prosecuting systemic atrocities while shaping the norms for future international justice frameworks. Decolonization accelerated in the aftermath of World War II. European powers, weakened economically and militarily, struggled to maintain colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Independence movements gained momentum, leading to the emergence of new nations such as India, 1947, Indonesia, 1949, and several African states during the 1950s and 1960s. The war had exposed the fragility of colonial control and demonstrated the efficacy of organized political and military resistance, reshaping global power dynamics and challenging Eurocentric dominance. World War II left an indelible mark on global memory and identity. It revealed both the capacity for human cruelty and the resilience of individuals and nations in the face of unparalleled suffering. The conflict reshaped political borders, economies, societies, and technologies, setting the stage for the late 20th century's ideological confrontations, rapid globalization, and reconfigured international institutions. Its legacy was a mixture of cautionary lessons, institutional frameworks designed to prevent recurrence, and a collective understanding of the costs of total war. The war's aftermath demonstrated that the consequences of global conflict extended far beyond immediate military victories and defeats. Economies were reconstructed, alliances were forged and broken, societies were transformed, and millions of lives bore the imprint of the struggle. The lessons of World War II on the necessity of international cooperation, the dangers of totalitarianism, and the moral imperatives of human rights remain embedded in the historical consciousness, informing diplomacy, governance, and the study of conflict for generations to come. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's bold gamble to crush the Soviet Union in a lightning campaign, commenced with the largest invasion in human history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by more than 3,000 tanks and 2,700 aircraft, surged across a 1,800-mile front from the Baltic in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Hitler's objectives were immediate and ambitious: seize key industrial and agricultural regions, destroy the Red Army before it could fully mobilize, and secure Lebensraum, living space, for Germany while crippling communism in Europe. Initially, the Wehrmacht achieved remarkable successes, encircling entire Soviet armies in massive pincer movements and capturing strategic cities such as Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev within the first months. Yet beneath these tactical victories lay logistical vulnerabilities, overextended supply lines, and an underestimation of Soviet resilience that would shape the war's deadliest theater. The Soviet Union, initially paralyzed by Stalin's purges of senior military officers in 1937 to 1938, struggled to mount effective defenses, yet the Red Army adapted rapidly. In cities such as Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, Soviet forces fortified positions, mobilized civilians, and employed scorched-earth tactics to deny the Wehrmacht sustenance. The Siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941, became a testament to human endurance. For 872 days, civilians endured starvation, bombardment, and disease, with estimates of civilian deaths reaching over 1 million. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the German advance stalled by December 1941, not only due to fierce Soviet counterattacks, but also because of the unforgiving Russian winter, for which German troops were ill-equipped. The Red Army's ability to regroup, reinforced by Siberian divisions trained for winter combat, demonstrated both strategic foresight and the capacity of a nation under existential threat. In the south, the Caucasus and Ukraine became critical theaters. The Germans sought oil in the Caucasus and grain from Ukraine to sustain their war effort, while Soviet forces fought tenaciously to deny these resources. Battles such as Rostov, Kharkov, and the Donbass region illustrated the ebb and flow of tactical success and failure. By mid-1942, the Wehrmacht aimed to secure Stalingrad and the Volga River, critical for logistics and symbolic value. On August 23, 1942, the Battle of Stalingrad commenced, evolving into one of the most brutal and iconic engagements of the war. Urban combat raged street by street, factory by factory, as German forces sought to seize the city while Soviet defenders, including civilians and militia, refused to yield. The fighting reduced the city to rubble, yet the Soviet command under Generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky meticulously prepared a counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, launched on November 19, 1942, encircling the German Sixth Army and cutting off supplies. The encirclement of Stalingrad became a disaster for Hitler. Despite the German army's initial confidence, the inability to break the Soviet siege, compounded by starvation, frostbite, and disease, forced the surrender on February 2, 1943. Over 90,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, many of whom perished in captivity. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility and marked a strategic turning point on the Eastern Front, signaling that the Axis could be checked and ultimately reversed. Stalingrad was not merely a military confrontation. It became a symbol of Soviet determination and the human cost of total war, with civilian casualties estimated at over 40,000 and military deaths exceeding 1 million on both sides. Simultaneously, the siege of Sevastopol and the battles around the Caucasus continued to tie down German resources. The Black Sea remained a contested arena, with Soviet naval forces conducting limited amphibious operations and the Germans attempting to secure strategic ports. Farther north, Leningrad's siege persisted, and Soviet offensives to the south demonstrated the ability of the Red Army to fight on multiple fronts while absorbing immense casualties. Strategic coordination among Soviet fronts, coupled with intelligence derived from code-breaking and partisan networks behind German lines, amplified their operational effectiveness despite material shortages. By mid-1943, the war in the East reached another decisive phase with the Battle of Kursk, beginning on July 5, 1943. The Germans sought to regain initiative through a massive armored offensive in the Kursk salient, deploying over 6,000 tanks and artillery pieces. Soviet intelligence, forewarned of the German attack through espionage and reconnaissance, had prepared extensive defensive networks, including minefields, trenches, and anti-tank positions. The ensuing battle, which lasted until August 23, 1943, became the largest tank engagement in history. German attacks were repulsed, and the Red Army transitioned to a strategic offensive for the first time since 1941, reclaiming territory across Ukraine and Belarus. The failure at Kursk irreversibly shifted the strategic initiative to the Soviets, forcing German forces into a reactive posture and signaling the beginning of a relentless westward push that would culminate in Berlin by 1945. The Eastern Front during 1941 to 1943 was characterized not only by its scale, but also by the extreme brutality and suffering inflicted upon civilians. Occupied territories endured mass executions, forced labor, famine, and systematic atrocities, including the mass shootings of Jews and other targeted populations by Einsatzgruppen. Soviet partisan activity intensified in occupied areas, sabotaging German supply lines, ambushing units, and collaborating with advancing Red Army forces, further complicating German occupation efforts. Civilians became both victims and participants in the war, facing impossible choices under occupation while contributing to resistance and survival. Logistical challenges defined the Eastern Front. The vast distances of the Soviet Union, combined with inadequate infrastructure, harsh weather conditions, and the destruction of rail and road networks, created chronic supply shortages for both Axis and Soviet forces. German reliance on horse-drawn transport, combined with fuel shortages, contrasted sharply with the Red Army's strategic mobilization of railroads, industrial relocation to the Urals, and mass conscription of personnel. These factors meant that victory depended as much on endurance, industrial capacity, and the ability to absorb losses as on tactical brilliance. By the end of 1943, the Eastern Front had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the war. Germany had lost its offensive momentum, its forces were increasingly overstretched, and the Soviet Union had regained substantial territory, liberated key cities, and demonstrated the capacity for sustained, large-scale operations. The human and material costs were staggering. Estimates suggest over 20 million Soviet military and civilian deaths by this point, with German casualties exceeding 3 million. Yet the lessons of resilience, adaptation, and strategic depth would enable the Soviets to press inexorably toward Berlin, shaping the decisive campaigns of 1944 to 1945 and underscoring the Eastern Front's centrality in determining the outcome of World War II. In the vast deserts of North Africa, a critical theater of World War II unfolded, where mobility, supply lines, and tactical ingenuity would determine the fate of nations. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, sought to expand its colonial empire, aiming to dominate the Mediterranean and secure resources in Egypt and the Middle East. In September 1940, Italian forces launched an invasion of Egypt from their colonies in Libya, expecting a quick victory. However, the campaign faltered immediately. British forces commanded by General Richard O'Connor conducted a daring counterattack Operation Compass, encircling and capturing tens of thousands of Italian soldiers by February 1941, demonstrating the vulnerability of Italian forces and the importance of supply lines and intelligence in desert warfare. Germany, alarmed by Italy's failures and the strategic importance of the Mediterranean, dispatched the Afrika Korps under General Erwin Rommel in February 1941. Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox, brought a combination of tactical brilliance, audacity, and innovative use of mechanized forces. Using armored thrusts, rapid maneuvers, and a deep understanding of desert logistics, Rommel pushed British forces eastward. The North African campaign was not merely a battle of armies. It was a war of logistics. Water, fuel, and food were scarce, and the vast distances of the desert made supply lines vulnerable. Both sides relied on ports such as Tripoli, Benghazi, Alexandria, and Tobruk to maintain their operations, while air power and naval forces contested control of the Mediterranean to disrupt enemy supplies. The Axis relied heavily on convoys from Europe, often threatened by Royal Navy operations, submarine attacks, and air interdiction. Rommel's reliance on fast-moving armored units and audacious tactics could not compensate indefinitely for the chronic shortages of fuel and reinforcements, making the campaign a delicate balance between brilliance and attrition. Meanwhile, the Allies planned a larger strategy to open a southern front against the Axis, relieve pressure on the Soviet Union, and secure the Mediterranean. Operation Torch, launched on November 8, 1942, marked the first major involvement of American ground forces in the European-African theater. American and British troops landed in French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria, meeting limited resistance from Vichy French forces, who eventually aligned with the Allies. This operation forced Axis troops in Tunisia to fight on two fronts: Rommel's Afrika Korps from Libya and German reinforcements attempting to hold Tunisia. The resulting battles, including Kasserine Pass in February 1943, exposed the inexperience of American forces in desert warfare, yet the Allies adapted quickly, improving coordination, tactics, and command structures. By May 1943, the Axis position in North Africa had become untenable. Successive Allied offensives, combined with supply shortages, attrition, and constant pressure from both British and American forces, led to the surrender of over 250,000 Axis soldiers in Tunisia. The conclusion of the North African campaign marked a decisive Allied victory and secured control of the southern Mediterranean, allowing for subsequent operations into Sicily and mainland Italy. The campaign also demonstrated the growing effectiveness of combined arms operations, coordination between air, land, and naval forces, and the increasing role of American industrial and military power in achieving strategic objectives. The Mediterranean theater extended beyond North Africa. Control of the Suez Canal, a lifeline to Middle Eastern oil and a key artery for global trade, made Egypt and its surrounding regions strategically critical. British and Commonwealth forces, operating from Egypt, conducted operations across Libya, Eritrea, and the Red Sea, securing shipping lanes and denying Axis access to critical resources. Air campaigns over the Mediterranean and North Africa targeted Axis supply routes, port facilities, and troop concentrations, highlighting the emerging role of air power in modern warfare. The Luftwaffe, while effective in supporting Rommel, faced logistical challenges and overextension, reducing its operational impact compared to more concentrated Allied air forces. The campaign also had profound human and psychological dimensions. Desert warfare was brutal, with soldiers enduring extreme temperatures, sandstorms, and disease. Both sides experienced high casualty rates from not only combat, but also environmental exposure. Civilians in occupied territories, particularly in Libya and Tunisia, faced requisitioning, forced labor, and displacement. The interaction between soldiers, local populations, and logistical realities created a complex social environment, influencing post-war political developments in North Africa and shaping attitudes toward both colonial powers and local nationalist movements. Lessons learned in North Africa had a lasting impact on Allied strategy. The importance of logistics, intelligence, armored warfare, and coordination between multinational forces informed planning for Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and subsequent campaigns on the Italian mainland. Commanders such as Bernard Montgomery, who led the British Eighth Army to victory at El Alamein in October, November 1942, emphasized meticulous preparation, intelligence gathering, and morale management, principles that would guide Allied successes in Europe. Rommel's tactical ingenuity, though ultimately insufficient, influenced military theory and the understanding of mechanized operations under extreme conditions. By the conclusion of the North African campaign, the Allies had achieved multiple strategic objectives: the elimination of Axis forces from Africa's secure Mediterranean Sea lanes, the preparation of Italy as a next theater of operations, and the demonstration of combined Allied capabilities. The campaign highlighted the interplay between tactical brilliance and strategic necessity, showing that localized victories, however impressive, could be undone without sufficient logistical and political support. It also underscored the interconnectedness of global theaters, as resources, manpower, and industrial production flowed from the United States and Britain to sustain operations in Africa, Europe, and beyond. The North African and Mediterranean campaigns were not merely preliminary battles. They were pivotal in the global strategy of World War II. They weakened Axis control, diverted enemy resources, and provided essential experience for Allied forces in amphibious operations, multinational coordination, and large-scale offensive planning. By May 1943, as Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered and the Allies consolidated their positions, the stage was set for the Italian campaign and the eventual liberation of Western Europe, demonstrating that victories in seemingly peripheral theaters could decisively influence the broader outcome of the war. The Italian campaign began in earnest following the Allied victory in North Africa, as the Mediterranean had been secured and the Axis's southern flank rendered vulnerable. On July 9 to 10, 1943, Allied forces launched Operation Husky, the amphibious invasion of Sicily, involving over 150,000 troops from the United States, Britain, and Canada. The campaign combined landings with airborne operations, naval bombardments, and aerial support. Resistance was initially stiff from both German and Italian defenders, but internal dissent in Italy and inadequate Axis reinforcements allowed the Allies to advance. The fall of Palermo on July 22 and Messina on August 17 marked the successful conclusion of the Sicilian operation. This victory precipitated political upheaval in Italy. Benito Mussolini was deposed on July 25, 1943, and arrested, replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who initiated secret negotiations with the Allies. Italy formally surrendered on September 8, 1943, signing an armistice that shocked both the Allies and German forces. However, the surrender did not end the fighting on the Italian mainland. German forces, anticipating the collapse of Italian resistance, quickly moved to occupy the north and center of Italy, establishing the Gothic Line and other fortified defensive positions to prevent the Allies from advancing toward northern Italy and the Po Valley. The resulting conflict became a prolonged, grueling campaign, characterized by mountainous terrain, harsh winter conditions, and well-prepared German defenses. The Italian peninsula, stretching over 700 miles from Sicily to the Alps, offered natural defensive advantages, which the Germans exploited to slow the Allied advance and inflict heavy casualties. The Salerno landings, Operation Avalanche, on September 9, 1943, marked the beginning of mainland Italy operations. American and British forces encountered fierce German resistance, including counterattacks and artillery bombardments. Casualties were significant, and the Allies were initially confined to a narrow beachhead. Overcoming these obstacles required careful coordination between infantry, armor, naval gunfire, and close air support. By mid-September, the Allies had expanded their positions and moved inland. But the pace of the advance remained slow due to German fortifications, mined roads, and the challenging Apennine Mountains. As the campaign continued, the Allies faced another critical obstacle at Monte Cassino, where a series of 4 major battles took place between January and May 1944. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, perched atop a rocky hill, was mistakenly believed by the Allies to be a German defensive stronghold, prompting heavy bombing in February 1944. The destruction did not yield the expected results, as German paratroopers and other units occupied the rubble, turning it into a formidable defensive position. Allied forces, composed of British, American, French, and Polish units, conducted repeated assaults, facing entrenched positions, artillery, and well-coordinated counterattacks. The eventual capture of Monte Cassino in May 1944 cleared the path to Rome, though at a cost of tens of thousands of casualties, illustrating the attritional nature of the Italian front. The Anzio landings, Operation Shingle, initiated on January 22, 1944, aimed to outflank German defenses along the Gustav Line. Troops landed behind enemy lines, but a cautious advance, compounded by robust German counterattacks, led to a stalemate for several months. The prolonged engagement exemplified the challenges of amphibious operations under enemy opposition and the importance of timely exploitation of initial successes. It was not until May 1944 that Anzio forces broke out and linked with advancing troops from the Gustav Line, paving the way for the liberation of Rome on June 4, 1944, marking the first Axis capital to fall to the Allies in Europe. The Italian campaign was characterized not only by its military challenges, but also by the harsh environmental and human conditions. Soldiers endured steep mountains, rivers, winter storms, and extreme heat during summer operations. Disease, fatigue, and supply difficulties compounded the physical toll of combat. Civilians in occupied regions faced forced labor, requisitioning of food and property, deportation, and brutal reprisals by retreating German forces. Cities such as Naples, Florence, and Cassino were extensively damaged, leaving survivors in dire conditions. Partisan movements in northern and central Italy played a critical role in intelligence, sabotage, and resistance, tying down German forces and providing valuable assistance to advancing Allied units. Strategically, the Italian campaign achieved multiple objectives despite its slow pace. By engaging German forces in Italy, the Allies diverted troops and resources from the Eastern Front and the forthcoming invasion of Normandy. The campaign allowed the Allies to gain experience in coordinating multinational forces, combined arms operations, and amphibious logistics, lessons directly applied in Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944. Moreover, it exposed weaknesses in German defensive doctrine and highlighted the importance of air superiority, intelligence, and logistical preparation in overcoming entrenched positions. The Italian campaign also demonstrated the psychological and symbolic dimensions of warfare. The fall of Rome, a city of profound historical and cultural significance, served as a morale booster for Allied forces and populations, proving that the Axis could be defeated on European soil. For German forces, the campaign represented a bitter engagement in an extended front with high casualties, limited strategic options, and the necessity of defending long, difficult lines of communication. For Italian civilians, the liberation was bittersweet. As the war continued, cities lay in ruins, and famine and displacement remained pressing concerns. By late 1944, the Allies had advanced through southern and central Italy, yet the German defensive line in the north remained intact, delaying the final collapse until April 1945. Throughout the campaign, lessons in amphibious operations, mountain warfare, coordination of multinational forces, and logistical planning were refined and would be crucial in subsequent operations across Western Europe. The Italian campaign thus represented both a strategic necessity and a testing ground, shaping the broader course of World War II while exacting a tremendous human and material cost. The Italian front, often overshadowed by the monumental battles of Normandy or Stalingrad, was nevertheless pivotal in constraining Axis resources, advancing Allied strategic goals, and providing operational experience that would facilitate the final push into Germany. It exemplified the intersection of tactical ingenuity, environmental challenges, political upheaval, and human endurance, demonstrating that even peripheral theaters could exert decisive influence on the outcome of a global conflict. June 6, 1944, marked a pivotal moment in World War II. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy, France, commonly known as D-Day. After years of meticulous planning, deception, and preparation, over 156,000 troops from the United States, Britain, Canada, and other Allied nations launched a massive amphibious assault along a 50-mile stretch of the Normandy coast. The objective was not merely to establish a foothold in France, but but to open a Western front that would force Germany to fight on two major fronts simultaneously, relieving pressure on the Soviet Union in the east and setting the stage for the eventual defeat of the Third Reich. The operation was preceded by an elaborate deception campaign, Operation Bodyguard, designed to mislead German intelligence about the location and timing of the invasion. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, and false intelligence reports convinced German commanders, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and General von Rundstedt, that the main landing would occur at Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing from Britain to France. This misdirection allowed the Allies to achieve strategic surprise, concentrating forces where resistance was strong but German reinforcements were delayed. Before the landings, airborne operations began in the early hours of June 6th. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped behind enemy lines to disrupt communications, secure key road junctions, and seize bridges vital for inland movement. British 6th Airborne Division paratroopers targeted bridges over the Orne River and the Caen Canal, while glider troops reinforced positions and provided additional equipment. These operations were fraught with danger. Poor visibility, strong winds, and navigational errors caused units to scatter, yet despite heavy casualties, they managed to accomplish many objectives, sowing confusion among German defenders. At dawn, amphibious landings commenced along 5 designated beaches: Utah and Omaha, American sectors; Gold, Juno, and Sword, British and Canadian sectors. The troops faced fortified positions, mined obstacles, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and artillery fire. The Omaha sector, in particular, exemplified the ferocity of German defense. High bluffs overlooking the beach allowed entrenched forces to rain fire on advancing soldiers, causing massive casualties. Despite these losses, individual acts of heroism, combined with naval gunfire support and eventual breakthroughs by infantry units, allowed the beachheads to be secured by the end of the day. Utah Beach, by contrast, saw lighter resistance due to navigational errors that placed landing forces slightly off target. Yet these forces capitalized on the opportunity to advance inland with minimal casualties compared to Omaha. Following the initial landings, the Allies faced the critical challenge of moving inland and linking the 5 beachheads. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear mines, repair roads, and construct temporary harbors, including the Mulberry Harbors at Omaha and Gold Beaches, which enabled the rapid unloading of men, vehicles, and supplies. Logistics were as decisive as combat. Without a steady flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and rations, the initial successes could have stalled. German counterattacks, coordinated but hampered by delayed reinforcements due to Hitler's insistence on holding panzer divisions in reserve, repeatedly attempted to push the Allies back to the sea. These attacks were ultimately repulsed, demonstrating the growing operational coordination and flexibility of Allied command under Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower and Bernard Montgomery. By mid-June, the Allies began a steady advance through the Norman countryside. Fierce resistance in hedgerow country, known as bocage, slowed the American forces, particularly near St. Lo. The dense hedgerows provided excellent defensive positions for German infantry and artillery, resulting in costly, slow-moving engagements. Canadian forces advancing from Juno Beach faced similar obstacles around Caen, where Operation Charnwood and subsequent offensives sought to capture the city. Meanwhile, British forces pressed eastward toward Bayeux and Corentin, steadily widening the bridgehead and linking with American units, consolidating control of Normandy. One of the decisive actions following D-Day was the encirclement of German forces in the Falaise Pocket in August 1944. As Allied troops advanced from the west and Canadian, Polish, and American forces converged from the north and south, German units found themselves trapped in a shrinking corridor near Falaise, unable to retreat effectively. Fierce fighting ensued, with thousands of German soldiers killed or captured and massive destruction wrought upon towns and infrastructure. By August 21, 1944, the pocket was effectively sealed, crippling German resistance in Normandy and enabling the Allies to liberate Paris on August 25, 1944. The liberation of the French capital, achieved with the support of the French resistance, symbolized both strategic victory and moral uplift, affirming that the Third Reich could be challenged and rolled back on Western European soil. The Normandy campaign exemplified the integration of intelligence, deception, combined arms, and multinational coordination. Naval gunfire, air superiority, and logistical planning were as decisive as infantry assaults. The Allies' ability to adapt to terrain, anticipate German movements, and maintain a continuous flow of supplies underscored the lessons learned from previous campaigns in North Africa and Italy. For the Germans, the failure to repel the landings highlighted the limitations of rigid command structures, over-reliance on defensive positions, and the challenge of fighting on multiple fronts. The human cost of D-Day and the Normandy campaign was immense. Estimates suggest over 10,000 Allied casualties on June 6 alone, with 4,414 confirmed dead. German casualties were difficult to ascertain, but tens of thousands were killed, wounded, or captured during the broader Normandy campaign. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with towns such as Caen and Saint-Lô heavily damaged by bombardments and street fighting. Yet, the perseverance of both soldiers and civilians enabled the Allies to secure momentum for the liberation of Western Europe, setting the stage for subsequent operations in Belgium, the Netherlands, and ultimately Germany itself. D-Day and the Normandy campaign represented not just a military turning point, but a demonstration of industrial, logistical, and strategic coordination on an unprecedented scale. It underscored the importance of planning, deception, and multinational cooperation, and marked the beginning of a sustained push that would culminate in the collapse of Nazi Germany less than a year later. From the beaches of Normandy to the liberation of Paris, the Allies had transformed months of planning into tangible victories, altering the trajectory of World War II and securing a foothold that would prove decisive in the fight for Europe. By 1943, the Pacific theater had become a vast and brutal contest of strategy, industrial capacity, and human endurance. Following the initial Japanese offensives of 1941 to 1942, which had seized territories across Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies Allied forces, primarily the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, began a methodical counteroffensive aimed at regaining control of occupied islands and establishing forward bases for operations closer to Japan. This strategy, known as island hopping, prioritized capturing strategically vital islands while bypassing heavily fortified positions, cutting Japanese supply lines, and isolating strongholds rather than attacking every position directly. The turning point in the Pacific came at Guadalcanal, where American Marines landed on August 7, 1942, beginning a campaign that would last until February 9, 1943. The battle was a grueling struggle of attrition, with both sides suffering immense casualties from combat, disease, and tropical conditions. Control of Henderson Field, an airstrip constructed on Guadalcanal, became central to the campaign, allowing Allied aircraft to disrupt Japanese reinforcements and resupply efforts. The eventual Japanese withdrawal from Guadalcanal marked the first major strategic defeat for Japan and shifted the momentum in favor of the Allies, demonstrating that Japanese forces were not invincible despite their early successes. Following Guadalcanal, the Allies advanced across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. In June 1943, the New Georgia campaign targeted Japanese airfields and fortifications, while in November 1943, American and Australian forces captured the key base at Bougainville. Each operation tested amphibious assault techniques, coordination between land, sea, and air forces, and the endurance of troops facing tropical diseases, harsh terrain, and tenacious Japanese defense. Japanese soldiers, often fighting to the death under the Bushido Code, employed deeply entrenched positions, booby traps, and guerrilla tactics, forcing the Allies to adapt their strategy to minimize casualties while achieving objectives. The Central Pacific Campaign intensified with assaults on Tarawa, November 20th to 23rd, 1943, and Saipan, June 15th to July 9th, 1944. Tarawa was heavily fortified with bunkers, barbed wire, and artillery, leading to high casualties for U.S. Marines during the amphibious landing. Lessons learned at Tarawa: improved pre-landing bombardments, better coordination of landing craft, and enhanced reconnaissance were applied in subsequent operations. The capture of Saipan brought the Allies within bombing range of the Japanese home islands, significantly altering strategic calculations in Washington and Tokyo. The campaign also demonstrated the logistical challenges of sustaining large forces across thousands of miles of ocean, requiring enormous coordination of shipping, aircraft, and supply chains. Naval warfare remained central to the Pacific conflict, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19 to 20th, 1944, known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, decimated Japanese carrier aviation, effectively neutralizing Japan's ability to project air power and reinforcing Allied naval dominance. Air superiority allowed subsequent operations to proceed with reduced risk to amphibious forces. The Leyte Gulf landings, October 20th to 26th, 1944, initiated the liberation of the Philippines, where Allied forces faced fierce resistance, kamikaze attacks, and difficult terrain. The retaking of Leyte and the surrounding islands severed Japanese supply lines from Southeast Asia, critically weakening their strategic position. By 1945, the Allies were approaching Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Iwo Jima, captured after intense fighting from February 19th to March 26th, became emblematic of the Pacific struggle. The island's heavily fortified positions, extensive underground bunkers, and steep volcanic terrain resulted in over 6,800 U.S. deaths and approximately 18,000 wounded, while Japanese defenders fought to the last man, with only 216 survivors out of 21,000 troops. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi symbolized both sacrifice and resolve, illustrating the human cost of advancing toward Japan. The campaign continued with Okinawa from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. Japanese forces employed kamikaze attacks extensively against ships, resulting in heavy naval losses. Throughout these campaigns, the Allies demonstrated remarkable coordination of joint operations, combining naval gunfire, airstrikes, amphibious landings, and ground combat, while continuously adapting to Japanese tactics. Logistics remained a persistent challenge. Supplies had to be transported across thousands of miles of open ocean, ships faced submarine and air attacks, and medical support struggled to keep pace with casualties. Tropical diseases such as malaria and dysentery further taxed both personnel and medical infrastructure, emphasizing the multidimensional nature of warfare in the Pacific. Strategically, the island-hopping campaign achieved its goal of isolating Japanese strongholds, reducing enemy capability, and positioning Allied forces for potential attacks on Japan itself. Each captured island served as a base for airfields, naval operations, and staging areas, progressively tightening the noose around the Japanese archipelago. By mid-1945, with Iwo Jima and Okinawa secured, the Allies were within striking distance of Japan, both for conventional bombardment and, as later events would demonstrate, the atomic bomb. The Pacific theater also highlighted the intersection of industrial capacity and warfare. The United States' ability to produce ships, aircraft, and munitions on an unprecedented scale enabled sustained offensives across thousands of miles, contrasting sharply with Japan's increasingly limited industrial base and diminishing access to oil and raw materials. Intelligence operations, including code-breaking at stations like Station HYPO in Hawaii, allowed the Allies to anticipate Japanese movements, as demonstrated at Midway in 1942, setting a precedent for operational advantage that continued throughout 1943 to 1945. The human dimension of the Pacific theater was stark and unforgiving. Soldiers faced extreme heat, monsoon rains, volcanic terrain, and heavily fortified positions. Civilians in occupied territories endured forced labor, displacement, starvation, and brutal treatment by Japanese military authorities. Japanese defenders, indoctrinated and committed to fighting to the death, inflicted immense casualties on Allied forces while suffering catastrophic losses themselves. The cumulative impact of these battles stretching from Guadalcanal to Okinawa shaped the Allies' perception of the potential costs of a direct invasion of Japan, influencing the decision to employ atomic weapons to bring a swift end to the war. By mid-1945, the Pacific theater had showcased the extremes of modern warfare: the combination of industrial power, amphibious operations, aerial dominance, and human endurance required to overcome determined defenders across thousands of miles of ocean and thousands of kilometers of islands. Every victory, from Guadalcanal to Okinawa, brought the Allies closer to Japan, demonstrating that strategic planning, technological superiority, and unyielding perseverance could gradually overcome even the most fanatical resistance. By late 1944, the Third Reich faced an increasingly untenable situation. Following the successful Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and the subsequent liberation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, German forces were forced into a continuous retreat on the Western Front. The relentless pressure from the Allies, combined with the Soviet advances in the East, stretched German resources, manpower, and morale to their limits. Hitler's once formidable Wehrmacht was increasingly comprised of young conscripts, hastily trained Volkssturm militias, and depleted units that had been battered across multiple fronts. Yet he remained committed to fighting to the bitter end, refusing any strategic withdrawals that might preserve forces for defense of the homeland. The final German offensive on the Western Front came in December 1944 in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler sought to split the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Allies. German forces achieved initial surprise, driving a deep salient into the Ardennes forest, creating a bulge in the Allied front. Harsh winter conditions, including snow and freezing temperatures, compounded the difficulty for both attackers and defenders. Despite initial gains, the offensive faltered due to staunch resistance from American forces at Bastogne, logistical shortcomings, and the rapid regrouping of Allied reinforcements. By late January 1945, the Allies had regained lost ground, inflicting irrecoverable casualties on German forces and leaving the Western Front wide open for the final Allied push into Germany. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly in a series of offensives designed to collapse the German defense from the east. Beginning in January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive pushed German forces out of Poland, capturing Warsaw on January 17th and advancing to the Oder River by February, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. The pace of the Soviet advance was staggering. Massive combined arms operations, including artillery, tanks, and infantry, supported by air superiority, overwhelmed German units that were outnumbered, exhausted, and demoralized. Civilians in occupied territories faced the dual threats of retreating German forces and advancing Soviet troops, resulting in mass displacement, atrocities, and widespread destruction of infrastructure. As April 1945 dawned, The Allies on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine River, securing key industrial regions of the Ruhr and further destabilizing German logistics. American and British forces converged from the west while the Soviets pressed from the east. German cities were increasingly under siege, with infrastructure crumbling under continuous bombing campaigns, artillery barrages, and street-to-street combat. The Battle for Berlin, launched on April 16, 1945, saw over 2 million Soviet troops encircle the city. Intense urban combat ensued, with the Red Army systematically advancing through streets, buildings, and bunkers, while Hitler's remaining forces attempted desperate counterattacks that yielded little success. Adolf Hitler, isolated in his Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, remained in denial of the inevitable collapse. Despite pleas from military commanders to authorize a strategic withdrawal or surrender, he insisted on defending Berlin to the last man. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces entered central Berlin and the Red Army captured key government buildings, Hitler committed suicide alongside Eva Braun, his longtime companion, who had joined him in the bunker. Their deaths symbolized the disintegration of Nazi command and the psychological collapse of the regime. Following Hitler's suicide, Admiral Karl Donitz assumed the role of Reich president and attempted to negotiate partial surrenders with Western allies while continuing resistance against the Soviets. However, German military capabilities were exhausted. On May 7, 1945, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Reims, France, to Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. The surrender took effect on May 8, 1945, celebrated as Victory in Europe Day, V-Day. Across the continent, jubilant celebrations erupted, yet cities lay in ruins, populations were displaced, and millions of soldiers and civilians had perished. The fall of Germany revealed the catastrophic consequences of totalitarian ideology combined with military overreach. German infrastructure, railways, factories, and housing was decimated by sustained Allied bombing campaigns and ground fighting. Urban centers such as Hamburg, Dresden, and Berlin have been transformed into rubble, while industrial regions in the Ruhr and Silesia were severely damaged, hampering any immediate capacity for reconstruction. Millions of German civilians faced starvation, homelessness, and the psychological trauma of a lost war. Refugees streamed westward, fleeing the advancing Red Army, while prisoners of war awaited liberation. The collapse of the Third Reich also revealed the extent of the atrocities committed during the conflict. Concentration camps, extermination sites, and evidence of mass executions were liberated by advancing Allied forces, exposing the Holocaust in unprecedented detail. The Nuremberg trials, initiated in 1945, sought to hold Nazi leaders accountable, establishing legal precedents for prosecuting crimes against humanity. These trials underscored the moral imperative of justice in the aftermath of unprecedented violence and genocide. From a military perspective, the German surrender marked the culmination of a series of decisive strategic failures. The inability to defend against a two-front war, misallocation of resources, delayed reinforcement of critical sectors, and underestimation of Allied industrial and technological capacity all contributed to the inevitable collapse. The coordinated efforts of the Allies in Europe, including air supremacy, armored advances, and intelligence operations, exemplified the evolution of modern warfare and the effective application of combined arms strategy. The end of the European War also had immediate geopolitical consequences. With Germany defeated, the Allied powers, primarily the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, emerged as dominant actors in shaping post-war Europe. The devastation of Germany created both a power vacuum and a pressing humanitarian crisis, necessitating occupation, denazification, and reconstruction. The division of Germany into occupation zones foreshadowed the ideological bifurcation of the continent, laying the groundwork for the Cold War. The fall of Germany also accelerated the final phase of the Pacific conflict, as the Allies could now focus their full military might on defeating Japan. Resources, planning, and attention previously diverted to Europe were redirected to the Pacific theater, influencing the strategy behind the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and the ultimate conclusion of World War II. Ultimately, the collapse of the Third Reich and the surrender of Germany marked not only a military victory, but the end of an era defined by unprecedented totalitarian ambition, genocide, and global conflict. V-Day symbolized the triumph of coalition warfare, strategic coordination, and sustained human resilience over ideological extremism and militaristic expansion. Yet the human, economic, and psychological toll of the European war would reverberate for decades, shaping the modern world and informing the collective memory of the nations involved in the conflict. By mid-1945, the war in Europe had concluded, but the Pacific theater remained an unforgiving crucible. After the bloody campaigns on Iwo Jima, February 19 to March 26, 1945, and Okinawa, April 1 to June 22, 1945, Allied forces were poised at Japan's doorstep, yet the cost in lives had been staggering. Iwo Jima alone witnessed over 6,800 American deaths and approximately 18,000 wounded, while Japanese defenders were virtually annihilated. Faced with the prospect of continued conventional warfare that could claim millions of additional lives on both sides, Allied planners in the United States pursued an alternative strategy: the use of atomic weapons. Developed under the top-secret Manhattan Project, the first bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, destroying approximately 70% of the city and killing an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people instantly, with tens of thousands more dying from burns, radiation sickness, and subsequent injuries. 3 days later, Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, killing roughly 40,000 to 75,000 people immediately, with casualties increasing in the following weeks. The psychological shock of these unprecedented attacks, combined with the Soviet Union declaring war on Japan on August 8, 1945, and swiftly invading Japanese-held territories in Manchuria, forced the Japanese leadership to confront the impossibility of continued resistance. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio address, known as the Gyokuon Hoso, marking the end of hostilities. This surrender was formally signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, officially concluding World War II. The date became celebrated as VJ Day, symbolizing the cessation of global conflict that had consumed nearly 6 years and caused the death of an estimated 70 to 85 million people worldwide, including military personnel and civilians. The aftermath of Japan's surrender presented immediate and profound challenges. Cities across the Japanese archipelago lay in ruins from conventional bombing raids, including the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9 to 10, 1945, which alone killed over 100,000 civilians and destroyed vast portions of the city. Millions of Japanese soldiers remained in occupied territories in China, Korea, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands, requiring organized repatriation and demobilization. Civilian populations faced famine, displacement, and disease, while the country's infrastructure, factories, ports, railways, and utilities had been extensively damaged by Allied bombing campaigns, necessitating comprehensive reconstruction efforts. The war also exposed the full extent of Japanese wartime atrocities. Occupied territories revealed mass killings, forced labor, sexual slavery through the comfort women's system, and other crimes against humanity. Allied occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, initiated wide-ranging reforms in Japan. These included demilitarization, disarmament, establishment of democratic institutions, land reform, and prosecution of war criminals in the Tokyo Trials. International Military Tribunal for the Far East, which began in May 1946 and concluded in November 1948. Prominent figures, including Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were tried, convicted, and in many cases executed, signaling an effort to hold Japan accountable while preventing future militarism. Globally, the conclusion of World War II reshaped political, economic, and social orders. Europe lay devastated, cities destroyed, economies crippled, and populations displaced. Germany was partitioned into occupation zones by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, sowing the seeds of the Cold War. The United Nations was established on October 24, 1945, with the express purpose of preventing future conflicts and promoting international cooperation. The war catalyzed decolonization movements across Asia and Africa, as European powers, weakened by years of conflict, struggled to maintain control over colonies. Nations such as India, Indonesia, and the Philippines accelerated toward independence, reshaping global geopolitics. The Holocaust and other wartime atrocities revealed the depths of human cruelty. Approximately 6 million Jews were systematically murdered, alongside millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. These revelations prompted the establishment of legal and moral frameworks to prevent genocide, including the Genocide Convention, 1948, and the recognition of crimes against humanity as prosecutable under international law. The war's legacy forced nations to confront the consequences of extremism, authoritarianism, and total war on civilian populations. Economically, the war spurred technological and industrial innovations. Radar, jet aircraft, nuclear technology, rocketry, synthetic materials, and computing advanced rapidly due to wartime necessity. The United States emerged as the dominant industrial and financial power, possessing unmatched military and economic capabilities, while European economies required extensive reconstruction, ultimately facilitated through initiatives such as the Marshall Plan, 1948. The Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the Eastern Front with over 20 million deaths, expanded its influence across Eastern Europe, establishing satellite states and initiating decades of ideological confrontation with the West. Socially and culturally, World War II transformed societies. Women assumed critical roles in industrial production and auxiliary military services, challenging traditional gender roles and setting the stage for post-war social changes. Urban and rural landscapes were reshaped by destruction and rebuilding efforts, while populations dealt with psychological trauma from combat, occupation, and displacement. The war's narrative also influenced literature, art, and collective memory, embedding lessons about totalitarianism, resilience, and the ethical dilemmas of warfare. Ultimately, Japan's surrender and the conclusion of World War II marked not merely the end of combat, but a turning point in human history. The global balance of power shifted, international law evolved, and the concept of total war, with its far-reaching consequences for civilians and soldiers alike, left an indelible mark on policy, strategy, and memory. The establishment of institutions such as the United Nations, the trials of war criminals, and the reconstruction of devastated nations demonstrated a commitment to learning from catastrophe, even as the human cost of 6 years of global conflict remained etched in collective memory. World War II's conclusion in 1945 thus represents both closure and continuity. Closure in the cessation of hostilities and the defeat of aggressive militarism, continuity in the ongoing challenges of rebuilding, preventing future conflicts, and addressing the moral and ethical legacies of mass violence. The atomic bombings, the revelation of wartime atrocities, and the reshaping of international relations all serve as enduring reminders of the stakes of global war and the necessity of vigilance, diplomacy, and international cooperation in the modern era.